It's football at 4. John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN, Sports Illustrated, and of course, right now on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN and the free mobile app. All right, John. Win, loss, win, loss. What do you got? All right, never mind.
16-0. Come on, you know that.
Yes, we got that yesterday. As we know, it's very difficult to really predict what's going to happen, but I will ask, the placement of some of these games. You get that 3 games in a row at home stretched right before the bye there. Then you got the 3 road games in the second half of the year. You got that brutal stretch where you got to face Russell Wilson, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers. You got Kyler Murray in there. That could be sneaky. What are your overall impressions of how this thing kind of set up for them?
There's some good and bad. It's like a typical schedule. They're all basically the same, but I think you kind of look at where teams are in their particular situations. I think it's good to start against Washington on the road. That's a team that, in theory, could be improving. They got a better head coach. They got now a quarterback that's going to be in the second year. You had Chase Young to a group on that defensive line. I mean, it's just first-round pick, first-round pick, first-round pick, first-round pick. And, oh, by the way, another first-round pick all across that front. And at some point you say to yourself, if you're bad enough, and this kind of is also in the same equation with the New York Giants, if you're bad enough for a long time and you keep picking in the top 10, hey, you know what? Some of those players are going to be really good. And at some point, teams like that are going to turn the corner. So I think it's good that you get Washington early where they're probably still feeling their way with a new coach in a limited off season. Similar to Cincinnati, very early in the season. Joe Burrow might be a star in this league, but hey, get him early. He's not going to know what's going on. I think that's very good. And you mentioned some of those quarterbacks, Russell Wilson, Drew Brees, Lamar Jackson, throw into the equation. Everybody's got to face good quarterbacks in this league, but when you have them at home, that's better than having them on the road.
Yeah, no question, and we'll get into the quarterbacks that they got to face coming up. But at Washington, I do want to start with Haskins there because, you mentioned the quarterbacks. They've got the current league MVP, 4 likely Hall of Famers, the past 3 number 1 overall picks, plus you've got Goff, a number 1 pick, and you've got Haskins and Jones, who were top, 10 picks in the draft. So there's a lot of potential to face some quarterbacks. Now, we don't value Haskins and Jones all that much because they weren't all that good last year. But where do you see Haskins in year number 2?
Well, I think, he's I don't think you have a big enough sample size to even know. I think Daniel Jones, you have a more legitimate sample size, and I think, he's got a chance to be really good if he can, kind of cure the fumbling problem. And people have been able to do that. I think you saw the natural arm talent. So he's a little bit farther along because he's played a little bit more. But if you look at Haskins late in the season against the Eagles when they were down there, I mean, he played pretty well in that game. He actually did some nice things. So, there's significant talent there. But I do think there's still, Jim Schwartz always calls it, that uptick where you have to start and you have to pay the price to it. When you put young players out there, and he calls them startup costs. And I think Washington is still going through that, and that's why I think it's good for the Eagles to get them on the road week 1 before maybe they start to figure some of those things out in the second half of the season.
We had Sal on, and he told us that they have the 8th easiest schedule in the NFL. Does that surprise you?
No, I'm not a big strength of schedule guy for the simple reason. I mean, that has to do with records from last year, and that has to do with being in a bad division. I mean, that's, you play bad teams. I mean, the Giants were bad, the Redskins were bad, and the Cowboys were okay. And the NFC East as a whole was one of the worst divisions. So That's all that means. And we know how fluid the NFL is. And, there's worst to first every year in this league. And one of the reasons why is because it's a 32-team league, but there's only 16 games. That means everybody's not playing everybody. It's not an equal playing field. So when you have these first-place schedules versus last-place schedules, you always see these teams jump up who are ready to make that next step, and you see those teams jump down who have to play first-place schedule. So if you're asking me what's a negative for the Eagles, it's the first-place schedule. They won the division. That means when they go outside the division, and Mike brought up some of those teams, they're playing good teams or projected to be good teams instead of bad teams. And that's the advantage teams like the Giants and Redskins have. So, if you think Daniel Jones is ready to take off, you have Saquon Barkley. I talk about these picks in the top 10. I just mentioned Washington's defensive line. If you believe in Haskins, if you believe in Ron Rivera, at some point, those two teams are going to start getting better again. And that's the concern.
Yep, no question. We kind of touched on the fact that you can't keep lumping up on those two teams forever, but you got to make sure you do lump up on them why they are still lump-upable, if that makes sense. At JF McMullen, John McMullen, that first block, that first quarter of the season at Washington, the Rams, the Bengals, and at San Francisco. The Rams are a team that has to travel across the country. Not sure what to think about them. They went to the Super Bowl. Last year they were disappointing. I'm not sure what kind of opponent they seem to be right now, but they still have Goff, the number one pick. He seems to be up and down. This is a pretty big year for him, you would think.
Yeah, no question. I think it's a big year for Sean McVay as well as the head coach. I mean,
No. He's allowed to do what he wants.
If you think about them moving on from Wade Phillips, I just mentioned, how quickly this league moves, and you're the flavor of the month, and it's called flavor of the month for one reason. The next month is coming, and it can turn on you very, very quickly. And you've seen not only from a standpoint of you're moving on from one of the great defensive coordinators of all time, but they've also had some issues from contract standpoints and less need paying people probably a little bit over value, and that has come home to roost. And Todd Gurley's moved on, and things of that nature. You look at Clay Matthews; they probably shouldn't have brought him in to begin with, but you lose Fowler as well. Aaron Donald needs some help on that front seven. You look at a team that was in the Super Bowl, that close to winning the Super Bowl, and they've taken a step back. The question is, can they stop, or are they going to take another step back? I mean, right now it's so early, it's tough to project, but I would say it's trending in a negative direction for the Rams. No question about that.
One of the big stretches for me is that 49ers, Steelers, Ravens stretch, week 4, 5, and 6. What should we expect out of the Pittsburgh Steelers and Big Ben?
Well, you have to see. I mean, you talk about all the odds are coming out, and the Ravens, for instance, they're the one team that's favored in all 16 games from the early lines. So you know how talented they are. But one of the things with the Steelers is Ben Roethlisberger is, the odds-on favorite to be comeback player of the year. I think that's probably a pretty safe bet if he's got anything left physically. And you have to put that caveat on it because it is an aging player. It's a player who, let's be honest, that is not, the kind of guy who keeps himself in the best shape. So that's got to be a concern as a player like that ages. But from a talent standpoint and from a production standpoint, Ben is what he is. He's a Hall of Fame quarterback. For whatever reason, when we talk about these Hall of Fame quarterbacks, and he's a slam dunk, every bit the slam dunk that Drew Brees is or somebody of that nature. I feel like most people don't put him in that elite category, and I think they should. And if he's back and he's healthy and he's still got gas in the tank, Steelers are going to be a problem for a lot of people, not just the Eagles.
They almost made the playoffs last year with abysmal quarterback play. Yeah, I agree with you on the Pittsburgh thing. When you look at that second quarter, though, it's home sweet home at Pittsburgh, but then Baltimore, New York on a Thursday nighter, and then Dallas on a Sunday nighter. So you got New York on the short week, and the only problem with that is like you got Baltimore followed by Dallas. You got New York sticking in the middle on a short week there. You have that whole overlooking, and that kind of comes into play, the short week stuff. But at least you got 3 in a row in Philly. But Baltimore in Philly and Dallas in Philly with New York squished in the middle there.
Well, you always hope, to win the division games. That's so much more important than going out of conference. And as I just mentioned with the Ravens, a lot of people think they're the best team in football. A lot of people think they're going to be a significant Super Bowl contender, which I think is very fair. And as I just mentioned from the early lines in Vegas, they're the only team favored in all 16 games. So that kind of tells you what people think about the Ravens. So I look at that game and say, yeah, it's better to play them in Philadelphia than Baltimore. But even if you lose that game, I don't think it's that big of a concern if you're able to win the division games. And I think that's how the Eagles have to look at it. And the NFC East as a whole, I kind of mentioned from the talent standpoint, from the Giants and Redskins being down so far and getting at least talented players year after year after year in the draft now. They're starting to accumulate that talent. And then the coaching changes. I think clearly the Redskins are better from a coaching standpoint. Clearly the Cowboys are better than from a coaching standpoint. The Giants are the one question. Nobody knows much at all about Joe Judge, so you have to still see. But it's pretty good chances they're going to be better than they were, at least. So these are things that are kind of concerning in the fact that, the Eagles have had a significant coaching advantage in the division for a while now. That might be slipping at least a little bit, and from a talent standpoint as well. You keep adding players like Saquon Barkley and Chase Young on other teams. That's going to catch up to you at some point.
Do you see this as a 10-win schedule? Because I personally have it at 9 wins. Now, there's a couple that can obviously go either or, but I see this under 10 wins. Do you think that they can win double digits?
Yeah, I think they could win double digits. Everything, is, contingent on health, and that's been an issue for the Eagles for a number of years. And you would think maybe the worm turns just from a luck standpoint. It generally doesn't happen year after year after year after year. We're only age related, but it hasn't been that way for the Eagles. So you would think at some point they'll have a healthier standpoint. But the one thing about the Eagles, and you can criticize them for a lot of things, but I think they build their teams the correct way. They build up front on both sides of the football. They still have a top 10 offensive line. They still have a top 10 defensive line. You could argue they're top 5 offensive line, top 5 defensive line, and they have a quarterback. So anytime you have those 3 things, you got a chance to win 10 games. You got a chance to be in the playoffs. So we can talk about the linebackers. We can talk about taking a backup quarterback at 53 overall. We can talk about the unproven receivers. You got an offensive line, defensive line, quarterback. You got a chance to win a lot of games in this league.
Yeah, John. And then the one area in this third quarter of the schedule, a lot of games are tough because you got 3 on the road. You got the Giants, Cleveland, and Green Bay with Seattle at home squished in the middle. So it's at New York, at Cleveland, Seattle, and Green Bay. Forget the fact that you've had all sorts of troubles with Seattle. You won at Lambeau last year. Hard-pressed to think you're going to win there 2 years in a row. But the Giants and Cleveland, so the 3 out of 4 road games, do you at least like the way they were situated?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like the way Green Bay was situated because it's December. I mean, if you have Green Bay on your schedule, you want it early. You want it September. And anytime you have December, then you have to hope. And you have to hope the weather is decent. And if it isn't, probably going to be an issue for you. So I don't like it from that standpoint. I mean, this team can't beat Russell Wilson to this point. So until they do it, it's hard to imagine them doing it. It's hard to count on them doing it. So I think that's a mental hurdle they have to overcome. So it's not who you play, it's when you play them. So I put that on everything in every NFL game, because something that looks daunting, and we mentioned Baltimore and them favored in every game, and that looks pretty daunting even at home. But guess what? Lamar Jackson sprains his ankle the week before.
Right.
Not too daunting anymore.
Right. All this conversation is contingent on people being healthy at the time of the game.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I said, you talk about the Packers and the history and Lambeau Field, December, all that doesn't look good. You mentioned they won last year. They're probably not going to do it again. All that doesn't look good. You know what? But from Green Bay's standpoint, they got a young head coach and a young general manager who seem to think scheme is more important than one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. So, things could go off the rails really, really quickly for that team. And that's why we talk about it. I mean, you have to talk about it when the schedule comes out. It's all fun. It's all great. But, just because Green Bay was great for 25 years doesn't mean they're going to be great on December 6th this year.
John McMullen, Football at 4. The last quarter of this season here, the way you break it down, finished strong. You got the Saints at the Cardinals. I think that Cardinals game could be tricky. You got Murray in his second year. You got him Hopkins now. It's on the road at Dallas and Washington. So 2 straight on the road before you open the season with Washington and then close the season with Washington. But having the Saints and then travel on the road for 2 straight could be an interesting December.
Yeah, it certainly could. And we mentioned having the quarterbacks in Lincoln Financial Field. That will help. And certainly late, a dome team, there you want the weather to be bad in Philadelphia for them. And that could help you in that kind of scenario. If you look at last year, you don't have to go back very far. I mean, there were 2 things that decided the NFC East. The health of Dak Prescott and the fact that game number 2 was here late in the season. Well, game number 2 is going to be there late in the season. So if it does come down to Eagles-Cowboys again, de facto NFC East title game, probably don't like having the Cowboys here early and having to go down there late.
Gil and I were talking about that surprise team where heading into the season, you don't really expect them to be that great. And then you find out halfway through the season, whoa, they are a pretty damn good football team. Who do you think that can be on this schedule?
Yeah, we likened it to Buffalo last year, that when you saw Buffalo originally, you're like, Buffalo, but they turned out to be a playoff team.
Yeah, I would go. I think there's 2 chances. One is Washington, and one is Arizona. Arizona because of the offense and Kyler Murray, if he takes that, and a lot depends on Dwayne Haskins. But I got to tell you, if you look at last year, you bring up Buffalo. I'd argue San Francisco, and San Francisco wasn't about Kyle Shanahan. It wasn't about Jimmy Garoppolo. Kyle's a really good coach, not trying to downplay him, but it was Nick Bosa, and it was that defensive line. And he was the final piece of an ultra-talented puzzle. And I just look at Washington, and I look at Jonathan Allen, and I look at Deron Payne, and I look at Montez Sweat, and I look at Ryan Kerrigan, who's still there and people forget about. And then you add Chase Young to that mix, who's supposed to be farther along, if anything, than Nick Bosa was. that is going to be a tough group to block.
And the Eagles have had
all of a sudden,
the Eagles have had their issues with Washington even in the down periods here.
yeah, with that front, and that front is so talented, and that's the reason why. I mean, if the quarterback can't play, it's still going to be really difficult for him. So if the quarterback is just terrible, and you can't win 14-10 games, I mean, it's not going to matter. So Haskins is a big part of it as well. But, boy, I look at that defensive line, and I say, how do you block that? And it's not just the Eagles. It's going to be the entire NFL. And I think it's going to be a potential San Francisco situation where people wake up and go, my God, look at that front. I think there's a chance for that, and especially think Ron Rivera and his history and his defense and his understanding of how to utilize talent like that. I think Washington is on the precipice of turning this thing around.
Jack Del Rio, too, the coordinator down there, he's had some good success turning defenses around as well. So, yeah, that's another tricky team to kind of go. Quick before we roll out here, Jason Peters has talked to the Eagles. We talked about that last week. He put this video out where obviously he's trying to let teams see that he's working out, but he says he's keeping his options open. Do we have any new info on Peters? Is this just basically, it's going to happen, it's just not yet?
Trying to drum up interest, much like Jadeveon Clowney, same type of thing when that report came out. A little bit similar situation in the fact that Clowney admitted one of the issues was the pandemic and teams not being able to take a look at him. Jason, same way, but he's older on top of the health problems. So I think that's part of it. But also, Jason's looking for $10 million a year. I mean, that's the word around the NFL. So 38-year-old left tackles. From his standpoint, I get it because he's saying he's a top 10 left tackle still, and he was last year, and that's a premium position, and it is. But that age comes into it, and I don't know if there's anybody going to be willing to pay him $10 million a year. So I think those are the two issues with Jason Peters right now.
Yeah, injuries have been an issue. He has started at least 13 games in all but 3 seasons, but the problem is those 3 seasons have been the last 3 seasons, including the Super Bowl where he missed the big game. But we'll see if Peters is back with the Eagles. That's probably one thing to really keep an eye on over these next couple of weeks. That and then that third wave of free agency, which we will keep an eye on as well. It's an interesting schedule for the Eagles. You can read more about it at 973ESPN.com. Follow John at JF McMullen. Check him out at Sports Illustrated and every day right here during Football at 4 on the Sports Bash. All right, John, enjoy the quarantine.
All right, you too, guys. Appreciate it.
John McMullen, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline.